Hi, so I'm here today with Claire Richards from the University of Worcester. Thanks, Claire, for agreeing to talk to us.
You're very welcome. Happy to do this.
We're going to ask you a few questions just to get a bit of an insight into the different careers that AoCPP members have, how they've got where they've got, and what life is like working in different parts of child protection. So I wonder if you could start, Claire, by just telling us what your job is, where you work, and what you do.
Certainly. So yes, I'm Claire Richards. I work at the University of Worcester within the Department of Violence Prevention, Forensic Psychology and Criminology. So I'm a senior lecturer. I teach on a master's program which is all about understanding domestic and sexual violence. And I typically, a lot of my work, day job, is about teaching students as graduates in multidisciplinary contexts, which will be addressing concerns of violence in the community. And of course, most typically, we will be looking at violence in the family, specifically around domestic violence. And of course, the inherent issues and concerns around child protection and safeguarding children and young people in these contexts. So a lot of my work, I'm very proud to say, is about teaching and hopefully inspiring the next generations of practitioners in multi-professional practice and safeguarding children.
Brilliant.
I should say, alongside teaching, I'm involved in research, and I'm very pleased that there is a strong connection between my teaching practice and my research activities. I'm a real advocate in children's rights and the advocacy of professional practitioners who work collaboratively with other professionals and specifically working positively and proactively with families. So my area of writing and research is really about promoting the advocacy skills of not just student practitioners, but the actual workforce out there in multi-professional practice as well. It's been a great privilege to listen to the voices and experiences of predominantly victims and survivors of domestic violence, and within that, child protection concerns that have arisen over the course of the lifetime. So yeah, and like anybody else, in terms of their day activities at work, we get consumed or overwhelmed by emails, and our time in the day probably is occupied with meetings. And we do our best to ensure that meetings are productive and sensible and worthwhile, but it's also about meeting people. I think I'm a great believer in networking and being inspired by other people's thinkings and approaches to problems that we're all facing in whatever context, whether it's in academia or in the reality and in the coalface of child protection work.
Thanks, Claire. I've been told a number of times in these interviews that there's no such thing as an average day in most people's jobs. Does that sound fair to you?
I think that's probably very true. Yeah, there's no such thing as average.
No, there isn't. The work is hugely varied, whatever role you're in. That's brilliant.
Yeah, it is. Yeah.
Can you tell us a little bit more about your career up to this point and how and why you got into child protection work?
Yes, certainly, Celine. I mean, I've often described myself as a bit of a professional nomad because I started my career back in a lovely place called Donegal in the Republic of Ireland when I was a student nurse in mental health practice. And then I came to England in the late 80s. Now, this goes back a long time, obviously. And my career remained in acute mental health services. So I didn't actually, you have to remember that when I was studying to become a mental health nurse, there was no actual recognition of the fact that children themselves had experiences of mental health concerns in the way that we appreciate that today. That there's an assumption that children didn't get depressed or didn't feel anxious, and it was my education as a student nurse. Others might challenge me on that, but that was my experience, particularly in clinical practice as well. We've come a long way from that, I have to say, and I'm glad to say that we're much more appreciative and understanding about the realities of children's worlds and the emotional and context and the anxieties and the worries that they carry around with themselves and in themselves, and how that affects their family life and their school life and their peer relationships and so forth. But I digress, because what you asked me was my career and how did I come to child protection. I was involved subsequently after leaving mental health services, particularly in hospital settings. I got involved in drug and alcohol related services. I worked in the voluntary sector for a short while when I moved up to the Midlands here in England. And subsequently then I became more involved in the local domestic violence forum groups within the West Midlands, and then subsequently in Worcestershire, where I now live and work. And I was very pleased and privileged again to embark on a working relationship, and a very close working relationship with what was then the Area Child Protection Committee, which was the predecessor of what we call the local Safeguarding Children Board, which has now changed recently to, in the last year or so, to Safeguarding Partnerships. So I was part of that history, and it was then that I became much more cognizant of the fact that there are real issues here affecting children. More specifically, when I was interested in working around the field of in the discipline of domestic violence studies, but the wider understanding of child protection issues and the importance of safeguarding children in a range of concerns, not just in the family but also in the community. So I suppose it was a kind of a gradual process for me in my career over the last 30-something years. That's a long time. I was propelled to it then because of my passion and my interest in the issues affecting families where domestic violence, alcohol, drug issues are concerned, mental health issues are concerned, and how that affects children and young people. So it's been a gradual process, Celine, and very much something I remain committed to, particularly in my teaching and in my research practice at the University of Worcester.
Lots and lots of interrelated themes there, aren't there? And it's fascinating to hear you talk about really how recently it was that we didn't appreciate children's experiences.
That's right.
A range of issues. So we've come a long way, which is reassuring somehow. So just moving on a bit, what's been the most positive or uplifting thing, do you think, that's happened during your career? Sometimes we hear the negative stories a little bit, so I just wondered what sticks in your mind as being a very positive moment.
Well, I'm going to stretch the question a little bit because there's probably been quite a few highlights over the span of my career, Celine, so please indulge me a little bit here. I think for me, alongside my career, I was studying law, so I was called to the bar back in 2006. So I qualified as a barrister, but I didn't actually practice in the law because I think my leanings and my interests were more around education. Hence, I started working in the university, drawn into academic life, I suppose. And there have been another of exciting adventures and highlights, but it would be very, very remiss of me not to mention the fact that when I was invited to be, and I became a trustee for what was then the British Association for the Study and Prevention of Child Abuse and Neglect, formerly known as BASCAN, and is now the Association of Child Protection Professionals, that the opportunity to become chair of such a wonderful professional association for child protection practitioners was certainly one of the utmost highlights of my career to date. I enjoyed that opportunity over the last few years, particularly the role of chair for 3 years to the Board of Trustees, because it was there that I really immersed myself in some of the great thinkers, writers, researchers, political activists, brilliant practitioners, experts by experiences in terms of their own childhood experiences of abuse and neglect. That it was a real, as I say, I can't underestimate, or I can't overstate the privilege this was, the inspiration that I had from talking with people, and the opportunity to meet great names at conferences, at the wonderful congress events that we facilitated over the many years of the history of the association. Where else do any of us get the opportunity to meet the wonderful likes of Lady Brenda Hale, who is now one of our brilliant Supreme Court judges here in the UK, Sir Professor Michael Rutter, David Finkelhor, Elaine Storkey, Bridget Daniel, and many, many more. And apologies that the list is endless. You know, that you don't get that opportunity, as far as I'm concerned, in my experience that spans a number of decades now, to meet with great people who have made significant changes in improving the law, in improving policy, understanding, awareness through research, and particularly the impact on practice in working with children and families in the 4 countries of the United Kingdom.
Thanks, Claire. Yeah, our community definitely is very diverse, which I think is one of the great strengths of it, because of course the sector is very diverse, and we all have to work together, whichever professional area or perspective we come from. So so that's great to hear. So just looking on the flip side a little bit, what would you say the challenges are that you're facing now in child protection, or if not personally facing, the challenges that you see within the field?
You know, and I'm speaking as someone who works in academia and I've been here for maybe, gosh, 12 years or so. And the word challenge probably unsettles me a little bit, if I'm honest, because the challenges that I experience in the life of an academic in a university is somewhat different to the challenges that my colleagues will face in social work, in education, in health practice, in policing, and so forth. You know, the challenges and the concept of challenge will be very different in various contexts. So I'm mindful of that when I answer this question, Celine. So my challenges, I would say, sometimes by comparison are perhaps not as troubling in some ways. And not everyone perhaps will agree with me, but I'm just speaking from my own point of view today. Challenges might be something like, you know, seeing gaps in practice and wanting to explore through research really critical issues around family life and improving the lives of children and families where they are affected by violence, and trying to access funding and, you know, adequate funding to conduct research that's going to be impactful for practice and multi-professional practice. And I suppose alongside that, I'm also aware, and particularly because of the nature of the program, the master's program that I teach in understanding domestic and sexual violence, it's probably a challenge or more of an awakening and trying to understand better how a university can better support students who themselves, because of the nature of their learning and their own practice, that aspects of vicarious trauma or secondary traumatization because of the work that they're involved in. And many of the students on the master's program that I teach are practitioners, thinking about the issues of violence and domestic violence and sexual violence and the impact on children and young people and adults really does kind of, I think, quite critically and poignantly touch people's lives and affects us emotionally and psychologically. And as students of learning, we also need support and space to reflect on these issues, and sometimes it's very difficult. And I think for me as an academic and as a teacher and as a supervisor of research with students both on undergraduate and postgraduate programs, it's something that's around for me as a challenge in how to adequately support students within the limits of my role as an academic, and how we support them through mental health services that may be available at the university, that are available but are certainly overstretched, and, you know, to ensure that students remain engaged with their learning because they are committed to it and are passionate about it. But by comparison to other practitioners in the real world of child protection, these are different challenges, I'd say.
No, I understand what you mean, but it comes up again and again, that theme that human connection is so important across all aspects of this work, and that is two-way. You know, in order to connect with somebody, you do also open yourself up, whether that is as a researcher or a professional, and there is an impact sometimes in both directions. So it is really important that we consider how we help and support people, whatever aspect of child protection work they're in. Thank you. You mentioned funding at the start there, and again, that is a theme that has run through a couple of these conversations.
Yeah.
So just putting a little bit that to one side, I mean, I know it can't be to a certain extent, but if resources weren't an issue, what would you change? If you were the Prime Minister and you could implement something to improve the lives and safety of children, what would you like to see done?
Do you know, I have a kind of a utopian lens to this question, actually. Again, Celine, resources are not an issue here. So what I'd like to see in place to improve the lives and well-being of children. So with that utopian lens, I couldn't help being deeply troubled, as many of us are, about this continued worry about the fact that so many children are affected by poverty in their lives. Up and down and across the UK, and that's a real issue. And I very much lament the fact that the demise of Sure Start and really wonderful early years provision for children across the United Kingdom is a real issue for me as a person who also works very closely with early years practitioners and has done very much so in the past in my teaching career to date. So I think what I struggle with is some of the inequities that I see within education and within health provision. So Sure Start, or that model, was, I think, a wonderful provision in communities up and down the country that should be available to every family, that all young children can access from a very early age. You know, preschool provision is really important, with excellent practitioners, and we have very many excellent practitioners out there in the field of early years provision. But more than that too, Celine, it's about ensuring that early years practitioners are valued for the wonderful work that they do. I think still it's a fledgling profession. I've often referred to it in that way. And it's actually ensuring that the practitioners have a because of their degree qualifications, that they have a salary that is commensurate to value their work with children, and in supporting families who may have complex needs, or troubled or troubling families that we encounter in this provision. So I think really it's ensuring that children do get a positive start in life, and sometimes particularly where that's not maybe always available consistently for them in their family circumstances. And something for me too is an issue around education in early years, into primary school, into secondary school, and I come to this with an educationalist perspective as well, is, you know, pedagogies of compassion and kindness are often, I think, underrated and overlooked. And I just think if we had more kindness about us in our institutions, whether that is in the Sure Start early years provision, in the nurseries, in the kindergartens, within the childminder forum, within our schools, right across the trajectory of children's education, that kindness as a philosophy and as a way of being would hopefully and surely have some impact about how we relate to each other as we transition into adulthood, and how that affects our relationships with others, both in the workplace and in our intimate relationships and our friendship groups, you know. So you can see where I'm going with the utopian perspective there, Celine, but I think that it's really about the investment in early childhood education and that early intervention support for families that I think is really critically overlooked and marginalized and compromised and inadequate. And I'm willing to be challenged on that, of course, but that's my worry at this present time for children and young people.
There's because always a range.
It will contribute to, it will have an impact then on children's safety and well-being, because you're surrounded by this kindness and this sort of early provision through, you know, early intervention to help parents that are struggling, or single parents that are struggling, and, you know, integrating the wider community perspective and safeguarding children as well, and supporting families where they are struggling. Good neighbours is a big issue there as well, of course.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, kindness and compassion within society as a whole is a big issue that I think is getting more attention in some sectors. But you're right, and I love your utopian view. Early intervention, family support, and re-establishing Sure Start the way it would be very high on my personal.
Yeah, something like that, and, you know, bigger and better again.
Yeah, absolutely. So what would you say to somebody who was just starting out working in some aspect of child protection, or maybe what do you know now that you'd wish you'd known when you started out?
It's a really good question, and I remember myself when I started as a student nurse all those years ago in my starched white uniform that was really uncomfortable to wear, as I recall, and feeling quite intimidated in a sense by, you know, in a very large institution, you know, the hierarchy within that culture, you know, unusual practices for me. You know, it was a you know, I was an alien really in this very foreign environment, and even within coming out of the safety of the School of Nursing into clinical practice, that was a big transition. That was a big jump for me. And I suppose really, if I was talking to myself then, as I was when I was 18 or 19 years of age when I started my nurse education, then I would say to myself, and I'd say it to anybody now in the start of their career training, whatever that might be, is be bolder, be braver, ask questions, ask difficult questions, don't hold back, but be prepared to court some sense of disfavor maybe. It can be a bit of a lonely place. I have had experiences of that in my past, in my career. Sometimes I wish I did more of it. But you know, it comes back to this bit about, you know, students and my own commitment to this in my teaching practice, about teaching advocacy skills to students, about finding their voice and expressing their voice, particularly where we are speaking up for and on behalf of those who are vulnerable, who are less visible, who are less powerful, and more so than ever, that certainly relates to children and young people who are affected by abuse and neglect in their families or in the wider society. So it's about being bold. That would be my clarion call as well for anyone starting out in their career now.
Thanks, Claire. That's a lovely take-home message. Absolutely, be bold, be brave, speak truth to power, and stand up for the people that we're there for. Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Thanks for your time to talk to us today. And
it's been a pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you.